Okay, localization of function in the brain. So localization. Localization is about the different parts of the brain having different roles or different jobs. So in terms of localization of function, it's a fairly old part of psychology where the scientists discovered that the different parts of the brain did different things. So you need to have a definition of localization. So localization is the idea that specific areas of the brain are associated with specific functions. So that's what localization is. In terms of localization, you need to be aware that your brain has two hemispheres. So a left and a right hemisphere. The left one sits in the left side of your head. The right one sits in the right side of your head. That's looking at the brain from above. Each hemisphere is responsible for specific functions. And this links to lateralization, which is something we'll come on to next, which is the idea that for some functions, one hemisphere is dominant or better than the other hemispheres. So lateralization is an example of localization. The words are similar, don't get them mixed up, but they are two separate things. So in terms of your hemispheres, they're very similar for some respects, but one major difference is the language areas. Language areas are only present in the left hemisphere. So this is a brain that's kind of looking left, as it were. There are two main language areas, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. You need to know where they are. If you think about them, they're alphabetical from the front of the brain. So Broca's is further forward than Wernicke's area, and they're to do with language. They're to do with language production and language comprehension. But these areas are only in the left hemisphere. They are not in the right hemisphere. But Broca's and Wernicke's areas are named on the spec. You need to know what they are. You need to know their language areas. You need to know where they are. So Broca's is first. It's alphabetically first from the front of that brain's on the left. Wernicke's is nearer the back. Broca's area is to do with language production. If you look at the link from the PowerPoint, there's some more information about this. Wernicke's area is to do with language comprehension. Damage to either area results in aphasia, which is an inability to so Broca's aphasia is an inability to produce language. Wernicke's aphasia is an inability to comprehend language. Again, if you look from the PowerPoint, there'll be links to Broca's and Wernicke's aphasia. When you're talking about localization, you can talk about the language areas, you can talk about the layers of the brain, which we'll look at now, and you can talk about the different lobes in the brain. So if you're talking about layers of the brain can be thought of as made up as three layers. As in the diagram on the right hand side. So you've got the central core, the limbic system, and then the cerebrum. So the central core is the primitive bit of the brain. It's the bit that keeps you alive. The limbic system is the emotional bit of the brain, and the cerebrum is the higher order processing part of the brain. But if you think of it from working from the inside to the outside of the brain, there's kind of three separate layers. So the central core is primitive stuff. It's the brainstem. It's the stuff that keeps you alive. The hypothalamus is in there. It helps to regulate homeostasis. So that's what the central core does. The limbic system is your emotional system. The hippocampus is in there. So if you could learn a specific structure from each of the layers. The cerebrum is like your grey matter. It's your higher processes. It's got all of your sensory information there. Your corpus callosum is in there, which is a structure we'll look at later on. We will come back to split brain research. Now, the cerebrum is made up of different lobes. Now, normally, a picture of a brain will face the other way because you normally see the left hemisphere. So apologies that this picture of the brain is facing right, as it were. But you can see that there are four clear lobes on a brain. The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe at the top, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. You could be asked in an exam to label the four lobes on a brain. Again, the brain is normally facing left, so you can see this left hemisphere. It's my fault. So the frontal lobe, that is a lot of things are in there, but one example is our consciousness and our awareness, our personality is in there as well. Parietal lobe, sensory and motor stuff. Your sensory cortex and your motor cortex are up the top there. Temporal lobe, sound and memory. Occipital lobe is vision. There is a motor area in the frontal lobe, at the back of the frontal lobe, that helps us move. There is a sensory area in the parietal lobe, which is where the information from our senses goes to. The occipital lobe includes a visual area, and the auditory area is in a temporal lobe. So when you're describing localization, you can also talk about these brain centers. So a really good one to remember is the occipital lobe one. So the visual area is in the occipital lobe. Information from our eyes is sent to that area of the brain. So this is just a recap of the centers. So you've got motor, somatosensory, visual and auditory sensors. They're in, each of them are in different lobes. Language area, as I said before, is a really good example because it only exists in the left hemisphere. Broca's area is your speech production. Wernicke's area is your speech comprehension. You can evaluate localization using brain scan evidence. So as an AO3 point, when you talk about localization, you can use evidence from brain scans, which suggests that different areas of the brain do have different functions. You can link this to ways to investigate the brain, which we will look at later on. There's also neurosurgical evidence, so evidence of what happens when you remove or damage through surgery certain areas of the brain. That provides evidence for localization. You can also use case study evidence of localization. So the case of Phineas Gage, the fact that his personality changed and he lost a bit of his frontal lobe, that can be used to, again, support the idea of localization. However, higher cognitive functions aren't localized. So again, some more AO3, you can argue that the idea of localization is reductionist or biologically reductionist. Some research suggests that it is the extent of damage rather than the location of damage that makes a difference. This is a concept called equipotentiality. Here are some exam questions on localization. It's a topic you could get a 16-mark question on. Question might look like that. It would probably be a question that asks about an extent. Remember, there's a qualification in this question here. Discuss the extent. So describe and evaluate how much brain functions are localized. Refer to evidence in your answer.